They never had that control to begin with. That's where we need to start. The statement by the dictator Putin that Kupiansk was surrounded, that 12 battalions were encircled, and then that they fully control Kupiansk, it's all lies and provocation. As for the real situation, the enemy has been trying for a long time to take the left bank bridgehead. Kupiansk left bank, Kupiansk, Vuzlovi. As a result, they are deploying a significant amount of manpower even under poor weather conditions. Lightly armored vehicles and other logistical shuttles are being used, which can help quickly move infantry from relatively safe rear positions to the front line of contact. Russian generals set the task for the enemy until November 1st, 2024, take the left bank merchant and the merchant, Vozlovi. This task has not been completed to this day. Next, we must say that the logistics of the defense forces are complex from right to left bank in order to bring everything necessary for our units. This is a major challenge every time. But despite the enemy's firepower, this includes air bombs, of which 50 to 60 can hit the crossing areas in a single day, and despite the activity of enemy drones, our engineering units and other representatives of the defense forces responsible for this restore the crossings. As a result, logistics are maintained at a high level, even during combat. This includes both supplying our positions and evacuating wounded soldiers if necessary. That is why the defense forces are holding the left bank bridgehead firmly. As for Kupiansk right bank itself, the enemy tried to outflank it with their sabotage and reconnaissance groups. To do this, they actively used engineering structures that remained from the time when Ukrainian territory was occupied by the Soviet Union. As a result, the defense forces worked to cut off these supply routes, specifically the pipes along which the enemy was moving. The 429th Full Cellist played a key role in this. We played one of the key roles, and of course this also means constant monitoring of the enemy on the northern outskirts of the city. A number of defense forces units were involved. It's important to understand that this is a collective effort. This includes the National Guard, the Armed Forces, the Special Operations Forces of the Security Service, the Military Law Enforcement Service, and the National Police. Different structural units work together as a single, well-coordinated mechanism, and we managed to cut off the enemy on the northern outskirts of the city. As a result, they are now unable to infiltrate the city itself or reinforce their units that remained there with a certain number of personnel, and there is no logistics support. We're not even talking about evacuation. The enemy fights until the mission is completed. What does that mean? Until the mission is completed. It's a one-way road, up until the moment we are killed. And as a result, they can't reinforce their units inside the city itself. Their logistics have been cut off. All the enemy can do now is try. Those sabotage and reconnaissance group units that remain in the city on the right bank of Kupiansk. In small quantities, they try to deliver the necessary ammunition, as well as certain equipment like the same Mavics, batteries for radios, using air connections via enemy drones. And the defense forces have a well-trained unit specializing in air defense, and some of these drones are being shot down. As a result, the ground operation continues, pushing the enemy back, both towards the Oskol River in the north, on the outskirts of the city of Kupiansk, and the ground operation within the city of Kupiansk itself. The defense forces are advancing. They go through every basement, every potential shelter, every house, driving out the enemy who has entrenched themselves there. A certain number of occupiers, finding themselves in a hopeless situation, surrender, but there are not that many of them. The enemy, who for a long time was preparing for information-related tasks, not military training but information operations, does not want to surrender because they have been convinced that the defense forces will torture and kill them in unnatural ways, and everything related to that. In reality, that's not true. You can see thousands of examples in open sources where the defense forces, when the enemy is disarmed and can no longer inflict harm on the defense forces, take them prisoner. And then we see that as part of the exchange program for our heroes, these Russian occupation soldiers are returned to the Russian Federation. Therefore, if we talk about Kupiansk, we are holding our ground. As of today, the defense forces are doing everything possible to build on the success we achieved in previous periods. And I'll tell you more. We are very grateful to the Ukrainian people for supporting us, and we have the means to fight, to conduct reconnaissance on the enemy, to destroy them, to deoccupy the parts of the territory that are accessible to us, and to push the enemy back to defensive lines that are disadvantageous for them. Yuri, in your opinion, what was the biggest failure of the Russian occupation army in 2025? Yes, everything they do. But in reality, let's be honest, if we take a proper look at the line of contact, we see that in some areas the enemy has had tactical successes. Tactical, not operational. The enemy has not managed to break through to operational depth anywhere. The defense forces of Ukraine, they have tactical successes. But if you count how many forces and resources the enemy is using for this, well, when my fellow citizens ask me, they say, Yuri, but the situation is really difficult, isn't it, on the line of contact? I say, yes, the situation is very difficult, and it really is very difficult. It's already the 4th year. We are holding back an enemy who is in a favorable position in terms of the number of personnel they can buy with oil and dollars and conscript to fight against Ukraine. They have more artillery. They have more aircraft. They have more capability to carry out airstrikes. The enemy has access to technologies produced by China. These are microboards which are then used to assemble FPV drones, kamikaze drones, and other unmanned aerial vehicles. This includes access to fiber optics. Fiber optic drones have become one of the main game changers of the war. I'll briefly mention this. Why? For those who don't know. So let's say here's a drone controller, and here's the drone itself, for example. And if radio-controlled drones, which are operated by transmitting a signal on a certain frequency range from the controller to the drone, left, right, up, down, and video feed, they can be jammed by targeting either the drone or the controller, disrupting and cutting off the controller when electronic warfare forces emit certain frequencies, specifically those used to pilot the drones. At some point, it becomes stronger than the signal from the controller to the drone itself, and as a result, the drone loses control and fails to reach its target. But when it comes to fiber optic drones, the situation is completely different. The fiber optic cable, essentially through certain devices, is connected from the controller directly to the drone itself, which can fly 25 or even 30 kilometers deep into enemy lines. And as a result, the control signals, left, right, up, down, are transmitted via the fiber optic cable. What does this mean? It means it can't be affected by electronic warfare systems, it can't be jammed, and it can operate in bad weather conditions as well as in situations with poor radio horizon. What does that mean? So, for example, the controller is here, there's some kind of hill here, and the targets are over there. When we fly a radio-controlled drone, the signal from the controller can't get through this obstacle we have here, and we lose the drone. But fiber optic cable just lies on the ground and keeps transmitting the signal. That's why China supplies a large amount of the world's best fiber optic cable, so that the enemy has the ability to mass produce these drones, which then block logistics for the defense forces, target our launch positions, our artillery, and our infantry. Now, in 2025, the defense forces have increased their production capacity. Ukrainian enterprises are manufacturing fiber optic drones, and the defense forces are actively training pilots and actively deploying these tools on the front lines. But what am I getting at? Let me answer the question. That is, the enemy surpasses us in military indicators in terms of quantity of everything we are going to discuss, except for certain types of drones, for example, such as heavy bombers. Baba Yaga, we are the absolute leaders in the world, and we have more of them than the Russian Federation. Russia, as of today, has not been able to produce them. There are no similar tools that can perform at a high level the same tasks that these bombers do. And now let's look, even with this resource, the Russian Federation is suffering unprecedented losses on the battlefield, while its successes in Ukraine are highly questionable. They still haven't managed to occupy Ovchansk. The fighting, and at this moment, battles ongoing. I'm grateful as to our brothers and sisters from the Kelestok unit and other defense forces who are holding this sector. In Kupiansk, the enemy was unable to achieve the desired result, got hit hard, and retreated. In Pokrovsk, where the enemy has concentrated an unprecedented amount of forces and resources against each of our infantrymen, the enemy can deploy 10 to 12 depending on how they send in reinforcements. The enemy has been unable to capture the city, which had a population of 60,000 before the full-scale war for a year now. The enemy began their assault on Dobropilya, but now our defense forces have regrouped again and are blocking the enemy. In my opinion, given what is happening on the battlefield now, if you compare the strength and resources that Ukraine has with those of the Russian Federation, the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian military are performing heroic feats here every single day. And I don't know of any other army in the European Union like this, or any country in the North Atlantic Alliance except for the United States of America that could counter the enemy so effectively. And right now, we are in a situation where it is difficult for us, very difficult. Let me say it again, it is very difficult. We are holding on with all our strength, but it is not easy for the enemy either. At certain moments, our defense forces are destroying the enemy, more of its manpower than it can mobilize and put into action in a single month. This directly affects its ability to conduct offensive assault operations. That is why the current situation is as follows. If our partners continue to support Ukraine, we will have the ability to produce missiles, manufacture our own weapons, and make drones. We will have the opportunity to increase salaries for military personnel and introduce additional incentives for mobilization. These are the so-called signing bonuses, which are paid out once for signing a contract with the armed forces of Ukraine. We can put additional pressure on the Russian Federation and undermine its economic capabilities, primarily by targeting the accumulation of oil, gas, and dollars, which they then use to manufacture weapons, bribe their citizens to fight against Ukraine, and directly support the front lines of combat. I believe that in 2026 we will be able to turn the situation around when the enemy will lose the ability to conduct offensive assault operations. And where the enemy loses this capability and no longer has sufficient forces and resources to carry out assaults, that is where a window opens for political solutions to resolve the conflict on the most favorable terms for the state of Ukraine. That's why I am convinced that if we have strength, will, and unity, and every Ukrainian has more than enough of this, we will be able to achieve the result that at the very least our children and grandchildren will not know what a major war is. But even after the end of hostilities, which God willing can be achieved by the end of 2026, there will still be a lot of work to ensure that a major war does not happen again. That's why we need to hold the line, grit our teeth, and work as if we're living our last day. The very last day.
And we really hope that for this, we will also need 3 million FPV drones by the end of the year. The Ukrainian Defense Forces will receive them. That's almost 2.5 times more than last year. This was reported by Defense Minister Denis Shmyhal. He noted that the overwhelming majority of drones in the arsenal of Ukrainian soldiers are domestically produced. Let's listen and continue.
The role of unmanned systems on the battlefield is growing, which means that producing innovative tools of war is our #1 priority. Our soldiers now have more ground-based robotic systems. This year, almost 15,000 UGVs have been delivered to the armed forces units. That is several times more than last year. UGVs perform tasks related to logistics, evacuation, reconnaissance, mining and demining, and patrolling. Some ground robots are equipped with combat modules and carry out assault and defensive operations. Denis Shmyhal, Minister of Defense of Ukraine, on Telegram.
As you already mentioned, there has been a turning point in the situation so that the enemy can no longer launch assaults, among other things. We understand that drones, of course, play a very significant role in this. And another point, how is Pereobladny improving his drones, and how is the enemy doing the same? What is he launching at Ukraine right now?
I just looked at the time and realized that if we go through every single item, we won't be able to cover everything by 9 p.m., but okay, let's discuss it. The main things that are happening right now along the line of contact. What is the main objective? The main objective is to use as few live soldiers as possible on the line of contact. Unfortunately, we can't replace an infantryman. There is no robot that could replace an infantryman. But we must do everything possible so that the Ukrainian infantryman has the ability to hold their positions. For this, we need to have a set of tools that help us understand everything necessary about the enemy, reconnaissance tools. This includes electronic intelligence. This includes intelligence data that we receive from our partners, as well as aerial reconnaissance and many other tools that we use to stay informed about what the enemy is doing, how the enemy is acting, what their plans are, and what is happening at any given moment on the line of contact. That is why, objectively, there are now more reconnaissance drones in the defense forces. More, and I'll tell you more, the types of equipment produced by the Ukrainian state and by Ukrainian private companies serving the military-industrial complex have objectively become much better in terms of resilience. It's not so easy for the enemy to suppress them now. And of course, the level of expertise among the pilots who specialize and consistently operate the same drones using very advanced equipment is very high. We managed to evade both the enemy's air defense systems and the interceptor drones they deploy. That's why we are actively developing in this area. About drones, we've talked about drones like Baba Yaga and Vashke Bomber, and we've also discussed fiber optic drones, which objectively are more numerous in the defense forces. I would also like to draw attention to robotic ground systems, as you mentioned, because this is one of the tools that reduces the number of people needed on the battlefield at any given moment to achieve the necessary result in defending our land and to prevent the enemy from breaking through our defenses. What do I mean by that? Previously, you had to take a pickup truck, reinforce it with armor, and drive out to the position, providing logistical support for the infantry position, for the logistical support of the launch site, the artillery position in that state. Today, transporting equipment to the front line with a pickup truck is no longer possible. Because it is immediately detected by the enemy and destroyed using those same drones. Therefore, when we talk about moving our infantry and other units that service drone positions, including the pilots themselves and those who handle other important aspects of combat missions, this movement mostly happens either with high maneuverability vehicles like motorcycles or buggies, but in most cases it's on foot. Sometimes you have to walk 17 kilometers to reach a position. 17 kilometers can feel very different depending on the circumstances, but that's what allows us to preserve lives. Okay, if we can reach a certain position, how do we deliver the necessary amount of ammunition, the required equipment, and other resources we need to hold that position and complete our tasks? Here, two types of logistical support come into play. The first is heavy bombers, which by means of air delivery, they supply our positions. And the second is robotic ground systems, which, as of today in the 429th Regiment of Falaise, provide almost 70% of the logistical support for our positions. And this is despite the fact that high-quality models, which can be used without significant modifications, only became available in sufficient quantity. We received them in the second half of this year. In 2026, I am convinced that 100% of logistics will be handled by robots, by robotic ground systems. Additionally, we still have one issue left, which is very difficult to solve. That is the evacuation of the wounded. The enemy never, let me repeat, never lets anyone go if they've wounded someone. If they see a red cross on a vehicle, it becomes a priority target for a strike. Such an enemy, you have to understand that for them, there are no rules or norms at all. They came here to destroy us and are doing everything possible to achieve that. As a result, in order not to risk additional amounts of our main wartime asset, our people, meaning combat drivers and medics who they work in the CASEVAC teams. CASEVAC is the group that evacuates the wounded from the line of contact and transports them to the stabilization point. These tasks should be performed by robotic ground systems, and this is a top priority task that needs to be accomplished yesterday, not even today. And believe me, we will definitely accomplish it because, as was rightly pointed out in your report, the communication and cooperation between the front and Ukrainian manufacturers is at a very high level, and only those manufacturers survive and remain on the market who take matters into their own hands and go directly to the combat units. And they ask what needs to be improved, how it should be done, how to communicate, how to process things, and they create truly high-quality products. Those who try to do pure business just for the sake of profit in military equipment and arms, for the most part, they are increasingly being left out of the game. Because in our case, any mistake in production or a failure to timely upgrade a particular drone is a matter of life and death. It's the lives of our servicemen at stake, so there is no room for error here. And this communication is truly at a high level. At the same time, we have to say that the enemy is not standing still either. They are closely watching what we are doing, what tactics we use, what drones and interceptors we have, and how we shoot down their Shaheds, what tactics we employ. And that's why when we talk about a detailed debriefing in public, what technologies we use and what tactics, we always keep it general. Why do we keep it general? Because the enemy will watch later, and if they hadn't thought of it themselves, they'll say, oh, that's a really good idea, we should do the same. But I think it's best to illustrate this with a specific example of how it happened. For instance, the interceptor drones we used to shoot down their tactical drones, and we continue to shoot down their tactical drones. reconnaissance and strike assets like Supercam, Zala, Plan, Onset, Molnia, and others. For half a year, we set up this operation in complete silence, shooting down their aircraft without telling anyone about it. Everything was going well, and then, at some point, the information leaked, and the defense forces quickly picked it up, and the interceptor drones were all over every information resource. The enemy, of course, thinks if that's how they're shooting us down, we need to do the same thing. They have the facilities, they have the capacity, they have what it takes to produce drones. That's why it's so important to keep everything we're doing strictly secret and to keep building up our ability to strike deep into the Russian Federation, to undermine not only their economic capabilities but also their production capacity. We need to strike deep into the Russian Federation, not allowing them the opportunity to produce the necessary amount of weapons and drones, among other things, in large quantities. And
just briefly here, Yuri, before the news break, if we have time. And what about artillery? How important is its role right now? Because we see that in Belarus, together with Russia and China, they are building a large ammunition factory. And this is for the production of Soviet caliber 122mm and 152mm artillery rocket munitions. Because
artillery is now nervously taking a back seat compared to drones. That's an incorrect assumption. Let me briefly explain why. Bad weather conditions, strong gusts of wind, fog, rain, and everything related to that. Drones, due to the laws of physics, automatically become less effective under such conditions. But artillery always remains artillery, and by coordinates, even without electricity, it can deliver fire strikes. That's why I'm very grateful to our artillery brothers who always cover us and work in powerful coordination like a single mechanism, because wherever we can't reach, the artillery can. And wherever the artillery can't reach, we can. And that's the only way. That's why the relevance of artillery on the battlefield remains extremely high.
Thank you, Yuri, for joining us. We're always glad to have you. It's always very interesting. You always explain things, especially those subtle points that ordinary viewers can't immediately understand how it all works.